When the first moving images were tested in studios on both sides of the Atlantic in the last decade of the 19th century, and the first actuality films were commercially screened at the Grand Salon in Paris in 1895, cinema was silent.
Oh, guess what happened when they showed this film at the theatre?
What?
This shot of the train coming in?
Yeah.
The audience found it so realistic. They thought that the train would run over. Yeah, a lot of people they actually ran out of the theatre.
Really?
Yeah. No kidding.
It happened first time to them, na. So.
My God.
Cinema remained silent till 1927, but the experience of cinema has rarely been silent for its audience. Silent films had live musical accompaniments. Sometimes, when these films were screened at fairgrounds, there was live accompaniment of sound effects.
Dong, dong, dong.
However, these sound effects were not integral to the expression of the filmmaker. The visuals conceived by the filmmaker were complete in themselves without the support of sound. The sounds suggested in the visuals were meant to be imagined by the viewer. The masters of silent cinema took their craft to a level of high art. Rudolf Arnheim, the German intellectual who began theorizing about film in the late 1920s, has discussed at length how from its very silence, films received the impetus as well as the power to achieve excellent artistic effects. To illustrate his point, he gives several examples from Charles Chaplin's cinema.
Silent film does not in any way give the effect of being dumb pantomime. Its silence is not noticed unless the action happens to culminate in something acoustic, for which nothing can be substituted, and which is therefore felt as missing, or unless someone is accustomed to sound film. The divergence between reality and dumb show gives the actor and his director plenty of leeway for artistic invention. The creative power of the artist can only come into play where the reality and the medium of representation do not coincide.
In Satyajit Ray's words, what was once patronizingly thought of as rudimentary and backward has now emerged as valid achievements in an independent and self-sufficient art form. An art form with its own special appeal and its own special aesthetics. Today, one can actually question whether the introduction of words into films was not in fact an introduction of an impurity, undermining the direct visual impact of the medium.
A radical change was wrought in 1927. While many earlier films had dialogues for very short duration, or one or two songs, The Jazz Singer was the first feature-length film to have both synchronized dialogues for considerable duration and numerous singing sequences. The audience gave a standing ovation to Al Jolson's words in the film The Jazz Singer, produced by Warner Brothers. The rival studios hoped that the novelty of synchronized sound would wear off. But they were wrong. Studios had a makeover for recording sound with visuals. Movie halls had a makeover for screening talkies. Initially, they were 50% talkie, then 70% talkie. Eventually, they all became 100% all talkie. The era of silent films came to an end. The early talkies were aesthetically inferior to the silent films. The camera lost its mobility. It was confined in a glass box to prevent the microphone from picking up the whirring sound of the camera motor. The actors too lost their mobility because they had to hover around the microphone hidden in the chandelier or the flower vase and say their dialogues.
There, in the bush.
Yeah,
You have to talk into it.
I was talking.
The editing lost its fluidity because it was not possible to cut a scene in the middle of a dialogue. Movies suddenly began to look like studio dramas. In fact, two distinct genres emerged in this period: Broadway plays adapted for the screen and musicals, which had singers who were paraded across the screen doing their turns.
You're having fun. I get to go by when you are done.
It's a holiday today, it's a wedding, and the thing is done. It's a jolly day.
Some stalwarts of the silent era stubbornly refused to switch over to talkies. Chaplin was one such master. He firmly believed that the spoken word was superfluous for this medium. In his 1936 film, Modern Times, spoken words are only put in the mouths of capitalists and their agents, who speak to the oppressed workers, not directly, but through a talking machine. And when Chaplin himself breaks into a song at the end of the film, it is a delightful rhyme of gibberish. The words do not convey any meaning, but the action is so eloquent that it more than makes up for the lack of meaning in the words.
La spinach o la pusho, sigaretta Portobello, sirocchi spaccaletto, ciletula tilatua.
Gradually, the idea of post-synchronization began to take root, and movies got back their mobility. Post-synchronization means that the sound effects are recorded and synchronized with the visuals at the post-production stage.
Ready, everybody? Roll camera.
Imagine a scene
And action.
where a protagonist is looking for a lost key in the wilderness. While shooting this scene, the camera will pick up a lot of unwanted sounds, like the sound of the cameraman's footsteps, chattering voices from a neighboring building, honking of horns, and the director's instructions to the actor. But through the process of post-synchronization, one can separately record the sound of footsteps, the crunching of leaves, birds chirping, and internalized monologues spoken in whispers, and synchronize these with the visuals in layers of tracks. The result will be much more realistic. The viewer's experience will be much more complete without the hindrance of unwanted sound. The effect of the scene will be much more overpowering. Post-synchronization gradually developed into a fine art, the art of mixing the right sounds in right proportions with the right image, and the effect was a heightened realism.
So what time is it in New York?
11:30.
Night?
Recall the reverb in the conversation between Kane and his second wife, Susan Alexander, in Citizen Kane.
Gee, 11:30.
The reverb emphasizes the fact that Kane and Susan are two lonely souls in the huge palace Xanadu.
Because we live in a
It also establishes Xanadu as a hollow space, both physically
go crazy.
as well as emotionally.
Nobody to talk to, nobody to have any fun with.
Susan.
49,000 acres of nothing but scenery and statues. I'm lonesome.
Recall the first starvation death in
Moti?
Satyajit Ray's Oshoni Shanket.
Moti. Oh, Moti.
Against the backdrop of the blue sky, we see two crossed arms, the priest examining the pulse of the dying woman. On the soundtrack, we hear in slight reverb a woodpecker pecking against the bark of a tree. Here Ray has used an ambient sound to create a dramatic effect. Recall another Ray film, Gupigain Bagabain. The sound of dripping water creates a suspense till the source is revealed.
Actually, the sound design should start from the scripting stage. Even before that, at the level of selection of theme or concept. You know, Robert Bresson has a very interesting remark. He says, a film dies 2 deaths and has 3 lives. See, when you conceive of a film, that's the first life. But the moment you put it down on paper, it dies a death, because you look at it and say, well, this was not what I thought. It's so imperfect. It was so great when I thought of it. The moment I put it down on paper, it seems like it's dead. But then since I've written it, let me go ahead, you know. And so when you again start shooting, it gains a new life. So during the shooting process, the film gets born again. The moment you see the rushes, you say, oh my God, I'm finished. What is this? This is what I've shot. It's dead. I can't do this film. But then since you've gone so far, you have to edit it. Then you start editing it, then it gets a new life. It breathes new life. And when you add the soundtrack to it, you know, it really starts breathing. It's the music, the effects, the sound that lends it new life. So similarly, in my films too, particularly in Shunno Theke Shuru, which took a long time to make, you know, it died so many deaths and had so many lives. And at each time, at each stage, the sound design changed.
Sound effects juxtaposed with the visuals at the post-production stage need not always be synchronized with any particular action. Such sound effects are called asynchronous sound effects. Asynchronized sound effects may be used to suggest a lot of things without showing them visually.
Yeah, we are ready.
Ritwik Ghatak calls it design by inference. Imagine somebody standing on the terrace of a skyscraper. He kicks an empty can. The sound of the can hitting the road is faintly heard after a couple of seconds. This delay gives an indication to the viewer about the height of the skyscraper. The height may be an important aspect in this narrative, and indicating the height through the sound may be easier and more effective than showing it visually. In Pother Panchali, there is reference to the train 5 times in the film. The recurrence of this reference is a leitmotif. It symbolizes an onward journey, moving out of the village towards progress, modernization. Certain sound effects may be associated with very specific emotions in a film. In Ritwik Ghatak's Meghe Dhaka Tara, when Neeta's mother spots Neeta with her boyfriend Shonot for the first time in the film, she is cooking. There is the sound of simmering oil on the soundtrack. This sound gets associated with the mother's apprehension of losing Neeta, who is also the sole breadwinner in the family. When later in the film, the mother spots Neeta and Shonot together, we again hear the crackling of oil, even though the mother is not in the kitchen in this scene. Sound may be used symbolically too. The sound of whiplash in Meghe Dhaka Tara is symbolic of Neeta's state of mind on finding her sister in her boyfriend Shonut's home. The whiplash may be called an extra-diegetic sound effect, since it is not a part of the diegesis or the story. Andrei Tarkovsky wrote in his book Sculpting in Time,
The sounds of the world reproduced naturalistically in cinema are impossible to imagine. There would be a cacophony. In itself, accurately recorded sound adds nothing to the image system of cinema, for it still has no aesthetic content.
As soon as the sound of the visible world reflected by the screen are removed from it, or that world is filled for the sake of the image with extraneous sound that don't exist literally, or if the real sounds are distorted so that they no longer correspond with the image, then the film acquires a resonance.
Now, the piano sequento is a technique in which when the camera moves through space, it also moves through time. In other words, I will show several scenes without actually cutting those scenes, without moving into a flashback or a flash forward. So there is this scene in which this revolutionary, Bhisham Dev Sharma, is running away from the police. And you see that he's running down the road and there are bombs exploding in the background. He crosses the lens and you can hear his sound, the feet, the sound of the feet. And the camera is tracking on a wall. On that wall are slogans which bring to mind that period, 67, 68, 69, 70. Slogans like, Chiner chairman, Amader chairman. The chairman of China is our chairman. Slogans that relate to the Naxalite movement. Suddenly the wall changes into a jail cell. There's no cut here. And a police officer talks to Bhisham Dev. Although the sound of his running is still there, he is inside the jail. So I've played with the time.
আচ্ছা সত্যজিৎ পাইন কি নিজে অ্যাটেন্ড করতে পারবেন? রাত্রে দেখা হবে, প্রস্তুত থাকবেন।
And then there's an interaction between the jailer or the warden and the prisoner. And the camera tracks and it's continuously tracking and there's no stopping the camera. It moves over a funeral pyre being lit and there are more slogans. And then the wall changes into a court where, there is a hearing taking place. And the judge remands Bhisham Dev Sharma to some more days in police custody. And as the camera tracks over the wall, a voice is heard. Somebody is giving a political speech. Who is that somebody? None other than the late lamented Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, who happened to be the Prime Minister at that period of time. And she's talking about how we should progress. And as she's saying this, in another cell, a prisoner is being beaten up. So the shot continues right up to the end of the wall. It's a long sequence, more than 5 minutes. And there are at least 5 to 6 scenes combined in this. There's no cut. And there is a very complicated layered soundtrack. To illustrate his running, the feet and the sound of the feet are very important. They almost become like a motif, something that repeats itself, a liet motif as it were. Then there's the siren, because the police are moving all over town. They're capturing young people, shooting them indiscriminately. It was a terrible period. So the sound of the siren is always there. Then there are the sync sound, the sound of the boots of the warden, creating a somber kind of ambiance, an ambiance of fear. And then, when Mrs. Gandhi's speech comes on the air, it's a recorded speech. It was actually a speech which she gave in Calcutta, recorded and superimposed with the crowd sounds and the clapping. And then there's the beating of this guy in the jail cell. the sound of the stick on human flesh, as it were. It has a strange kind of sound. And there's the ambience of the night, maybe the night crickets. So it's a layered soundtrack designed in a way to bring across the visual quality of that particular sequence. In this film, constantly, I've depended on sound, and sound has always conveyed something quite different from the image. It hasn't been subservient to the image. When Bhisham Dev Sharma comes out of jail, he's a mental wreck. His mind has short-circuited. So he hears certain sounds that others don't. The sound of water, bubbling water, or water drops, or a brook, or sometimes whispers, faint whispers that he hears in his mind and which reverberate in his room. Even when he leaves the room dreams of those whispers. So it's whispers in water. So throughout the film, I've used this kind of a track.
Eisenstein, Pudovkin and Alexandrov wrote in the pamphlet Statement on Sound.
Sound is a double-edged invention, and its most probable application will be along the line of least resistance, that is, in the field of the satisfaction of simple curiosity.
Sound used in this way will destroy the culture of montage, because every mere addition of sound to montage fragments increases their inertia as such and their independent significance. This is undoubtedly detrimental to montage, which operates above all not with fragments, but through the juxtaposition of fragments. Do you remember the battleship Potemkin Odessa step sequence?
Steps, yes.
Yeah, sequence. Thing begins with the revelers. They're cheering and waiting for the ship to arrive. And then the armies
soldiers marching towards them.
Yeah, they're marching down.
Synchronized.
Remember the elements that there were? There were these gunshots, this pram coming down, people shouting.
Huge chaos.
And so think what would have happened if all these different sounds would have been added to the film. That's exactly what Eisenstein and the pamphlet says. That would have been cacophony. That would have just made no sense at all.
Eisenstein continues, only the contrapuntal use of sound vis-a-vis the visual fragments of montage will open up new possibilities for the development and perfection of montage.
Counterpoint is a term in Western classical music. It means two independent strands, which have their own meaning or significance, are juxtaposed to create a new meaning, something beyond the significance of the independent strands.
Well, I'm not a crook.
To continue with Eisenstein, sound, treated as a new element of montage, as an independent variable combined with the visual image, cannot fail to provide new and enormously powerful means of expressing and resolving the most complex problems.
This is a perfect example of contrapuntal sound. There is no apparent relation between the visuals and the soundtrack, but when juxtaposed together, they suggest a new meaning. Certain powerful visuals do not require the support of a soundtrack.
Hrithik Ghatak wrote, silence. That is what I consider the most evocating element. There is no end to the ways in which we can play with silence.
Moments of silence give a breathing space to the viewer, especially before the introduction of a loud sequence. And silence itself may carry its own meaning. It may imply deafness or breakdown in communication. A mature soundtrack of a movie strikes a balance between the segments of sound and those of silence. We may conclude with Ritwik Ghatuk's words.
Whatever you think of the sound for a film, it is the design of silence that you have to chart out first.
In about 30 years of its existence, silent cinema had developed into a refined art form. The coming of sound gave a big jolt to cinema as an industry, as well as an art form. The initial years of sync sound were chaotic as well as problematic. The technique of post-synchronization opened the possibilities for creative uses of the soundtrack. Sound effects went beyond being mere appendage to the visuals and began to carry their own meaning. Eisenstein and his colleagues had suggested that contrapuntal use of sound effects would be a powerful element in the development of montage. Sensitive filmmakers have made significant contribution to the use of sound in cinema.